Well, good afternoon. I'm happy to be here. My name is Beverly Tatum and delighted to be joining you.
And I'm Martha McCoy, and I'm really happy to be here as well. So it's really nice to see you all today.
Marty Swaim, how do you do?
So we're going to start at the top. Beverly Tatum. Scholar, teacher, author, administrator, and race relations expert. Dr. Tatum was the 9th president of Spelman College. She is a clinical psychologist whose areas of research include Black families and white communities, racial identity in teens, and the role of race in the classroom. For over 20 years, Dr. Tatum taught her signature course on the psychology of racism. In her critically acclaimed book, updated just in 2017, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, and you will see copies in the, in the audience, she argues that straight talk about racial identity is essential to the nation and gives readers a new lens for understanding the emergence of racial identity as a developmental process experienced by all of us. Her 2007 book, Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation, explores the social and educational implications of the growing racial isolation in our public schools. Also an issue we have discussed this week and are very concerned about. Dr. Tatum is the recipient of numerous honorary degrees. She earned a BA in psychology from Wesleyan University and an MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Michigan. She also holds an MA degree in religious studies from Hartford Seminary. Prior to her appointment to the Spelman presidency, she spent 13 years at Mount Holyoke College, serving as professor of psychology, then department chair, dean of the college, and acting president. She has also served as an associate professor and assistant professor of psychology at Westfield State College in Westfield, Massachusetts, and a lecturer in Black Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Welcome, Dr. Tatum. We're thrilled you could be here.
Delighted. Thank you.
But we're not done with our distinguished panelists.
The long shot.
Throughout her career, Martha McCoy, Executive Director of Everyday Democracy, has made important contributions to the fields of deliberative democracy, community problem solving, and racial justice. She began at Everyday Democracy in 1991, becoming its director in 1995. Under Martha's leadership, Everyday Democracy has become respected as a national organization that excels in helping local communities build their own capacity to organize large-scale diverse dialogue for problem solving. That's what CRS also strives to do. She keeps Everyday Democracy at the leading edge of connecting public dialogue to collective action and democratic governance, and champions the need to keep race and inclusion at the forefront of practices to strengthen democracy. Martha and Everyday Democracy have won a number of awards, and she has written extensively about community problem solving. If I started listing the awards, we'd be here until late, and so I'm going to hold off on that. She serves on the advisory committee of the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, the board of the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, the National Advisory Board of the Center for Community Trust Building, and the Racial Justice Advisory Board for the YWCA of Greater Hartford, among many others. Martha's academic background is in political science, with her master's degree and doctoral work in the fields of political theory and methods, international relations, and comparative politics. Welcome, Martha. Thank you so much. And then close to home, close to my heart locally, my local hero, Marty Swaim. As a social studies teacher in the Arlington County Public Schools from 1984 to 2001, Marty noticed an achievement gap that could only be accounted for as a result of racism and its societal effects. In response, Marty co-founded an organization to conduct a workshop series for Arlington faculty and staff called Challenging Racism, Learning How. Marty developed the workshop curriculum, which uses reading, stories, activities, and conversations to encourage a basic study and understanding of racism, white privilege, the roots of racism, and its more modern manifestations in our society. The program is built around Dr. Tatum's book, Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, and provides information now as it expands to school and work groups, community organizations, churches, and others. In December, just last year, Marty received the James B. Hunter Human Rights Award, which recognizes sustained commitment and outstanding accomplishment in promoting cultural diversity and equal rights for all Arlington residents. I am thrilled beyond words to have this esteemed panel here today, and I know we are in for a challenging and provoking and inspiring conversation. So,
Thank you, Jill.
so we're going to get right to it. We want to know your story. Everyone has a story. Marty's work through challenging racism is centered on stories. So, Dr. Tatum, we'd like to start with you, but what brought you to this work? What keeps you in this work? We want to hear from each of you. What's been your path?
Okay, well, I'm going to try to shrink that path so that there's time to hear from other people. But I started teaching about racism in 1980. I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan and studying to be a clinical psychologist with the intention of becoming a therapist. That was my intention. And I got married, and my husband and I followed my husband essentially to the University of California, Santa Barbara. Still a graduate student, but he had an opportunity there, and so I followed him there and continued to work on my dissertation at some long distance from Michigan. But I was invited to teach a course on a part-time basis while I was at the university, and that course was called Group Exploration of Racism. And I had never taught such a course, but I had facilitated a lot of groups, and I was doing my research, my doctoral research, on the experiences of Black families in predominantly white communities, and certainly that encompassed some thinking about racism and how that works. And so I thought, how hard could that be? And that's what you do when you're 26. You say silly things like that. How hard could that be? So I started teaching this class, and at the end of the semester, the students in my class at UC Santa Barbara, most of whom were white, gave me really positive feedback and wrote things like, this course has changed my life. I think this should be required for every student at the university. Why did I have to wait until I was a senior in college to have this conversation? That was the kind of feedback I was getting, and so it really was so empowering for me as a young instructor to just want to keep doing it. We lived in California for 4 years, and throughout that time, I probably taught that course maybe 9 or 10 times. They were on a quarter system, so I had the opportunity to do it a lot. And meanwhile, I was working as a therapist in the campus counseling center, but it became pretty clear to me that there was a particular impact I could have through teaching that I wasn't having as a therapist, and decided to shift my focus into the classroom. And the rest is history, more or less. Yeah.
Wow, a wonderful history.
Yeah.
Martha, how about you?
So it's a great question. Again, I'll try to squeeze the story down, but I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and so when I was a young child, Richmond was celebrating the centennial of the Confederacy.
Yes.
And so that had a huge, impact on me because I was in a segregated school, and I was realizing, even as a child of 9, because I had been exposed to some other ideas, that there were ideas that I was learning in school and that I was hearing in the history of the city that were not coming out in the history. So I fortunately was blessed to be part of a church group in the Deep South that had multiracial teenagers working together. And so some of my first mentors in church work were Black women, and that had a tremendous impact on me. But I would say that even then, it barely scratched the surface of kind of opening my eyes as a white person to the realities of racism. When I went on to become an elementary school teacher, I did my student teaching in the city of Richmond, and I became very aware of the educational opportunities that were quite different in the city from what were happening in the inner ring suburbs where I had grown up. And so fast forward, all of this was percolating in my brain when years later I had an experience of exclusion based on religion, not on race. That was a very painful experience for me. And that was an opening for me. That was a window of pain where I could actually begin to see other forms of exclusion more clearly. And that really got me on my life path of helping to start an organization that was dedicated to people having a voice and to connecting with each other across difference. And in the very beginning of that work, which was the early 90s, I went to Los Angeles right after the civil disturbances there and met with people and heard people talking about the things that had happened and that no one in Los Angeles had a way for people to talk together across difference until something happened. And even then, they didn't have the capacity to do it. So the rest of that story for me has really been a journey of uncovering my whiteness, understanding my white privilege, and also uncovering what it takes to be in community with people while we're addressing racism head on. So, in a nutshell.
Okay.
Then Marty has a great story, I know. We'd love to hear it. I've heard it.
Everyone in the room has a great story. So I'm one of those people from a white liberal family. My folks went to the March on Washington in 1963. My husband was there, my sister was there. I served on the DC school board for 5 years, the elected school board, and I didn't know I was white. That's where the story starts. I mean, obviously I had white skin, but I didn't know I was white. When I really began to learn this was I was teaching at Wakefield High School, which is a school that has a mixed population of kids. And I found in my classes, world history classes, boys, Latin and African American, who were perfectly good orally. They could tell me everything they learned in the class. They would have gotten A's. But when they took a test to write, had to do an essay, they failed. And of course, you know, in that circumstance, a kid is doomed in high school if they haven't learned to write. These were kids without IEPs. They had no special ed problems, none of that. These were normal, ordinary boys who'd come through the Arlington public school system since kindergarten and had not learned to write. And you know, not only was I concerned about teaching them to write, that was really like, how does this happen? And it's still true today that the Arlington school system, which spends $20,000 a year per student, has kids in the 7th grade of color, 40% of whom read below grade levels. Incredible. So that's where I started. And then through many experiences, you know, as a teacher and as an active person in the Teachers Association, I came to believe very strongly that one of, if not the primary key here, is teacher expectations. You know, curriculum plays a role, there are a lot of other things that play a role, but teacher expectations is one of those things that's absolutely foundational. And just to stick in a little research here, Ron Ferguson, who's a guy who's worked in Arlington, has done some really good research, you know, interviewing kids and teachers, thousands of them over 10 years, and kids of color who feel that their teacher respects them and connects with them, turns in homework, and asks questions at 4 times the level as kids who are in classrooms where they don't have that experience with their teacher. Then there are 2 other tracks in which I learned about being white. One of them was I did training work with teachers for the Arlington Public School System, and I discovered white teachers are often first generation, college, and they see a working class or poor community underserved in their own life experience. And they believe in meritocracy because that's how they got where they are. And then the logic is you get what you work for. And that means anybody who's poor mustn't have worked hard. I mean, the logic is just, you know, it's a loop. It's a very self-serving loop. So I learned, and people say, you know, I can't possibly be a racist because I'm not unkind. I don't participate in racist behavior. And they can't get out of that feedback loop that doesn't acknowledge the whole system that they're a part of. So the challenge I learned is if you want to get white people to be anti-racist, you have to move them out of that system. And they have to be in the room to be moved out of that system. And they have to be able to hear the stories of people of color. And then the last thing that got me where I am today is I went to a training, we did, a number of us did SEED training, Seeking Educational Equity and Diversity, and went back for a second round, and the person speaking was Lillian Roybal Rose, who is a Latina and the daughter of the first Latin congressman who was ever served in the US Congress. So she's been in this work a long time, and she talked about, you know, all the issues that she had in her presentation. There's a white person in the audience afterward who said, I get the problems, it makes me very sad, what can I do? And what Lillian Rose said was, I don't need your help. You need to talk to white people. Own David Duke. He is white just like you. Change white people. So that's how I got here.
Wow.
That's great.
All right. So I knew you were going to be inspiring, all three of you. So I hope that you'll feel free to now just sort of discuss among yourselves. But I wanted to start with you, Martha. You've written, there is great power in deepening our personal understanding of racism, in creating respectful relationships across divides. And so from your experience and through your group, what is important about dialogue about race? Why is it important to you? What is essential? Sort of, if you all could each address from your own perspectives those points.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I would say that one of the things about race that of course, Dr. Tatum, you've written about is that you can't address something unless you talk about it, and very basic, but it's not just any kind of talk. I mean, one of the things we started exploring when we first started helping people have dialogues on race, we actually did innovate different kinds of ways of talking about race to find out what would work, you know, what would get people into the conversation. And it doesn't seem like rocket science now, but looking back, we struggled to do that. And I would say that one of the first rules that we discovered was you had to give a space for people to tell each other stories of the first time they either encountered racism or participated in racism or were affected by racism in some way. And I think one of the powerful things for that, because Marty, you were saying, white people often don't know they're white, and so their whiteness is invisible to them. And so oftentimes the story about racism that white people begin to hear and they begin to tell makes them realize that racism affects them too, and that it's not just affecting people of color. And there is something also about the alchemy of the empathy that's happening in the room when people begin to form relationships, because one of the things we discovered is there had to be some form of organizing. Unless you have a captive audience, such as a school or something like that, there has to be a way for diverse people to bring diverse people together. I mean, you can't just walk up to somebody at the post office with different skin and say, hey, I'd like to talk about race. You know, have you ever had a conversation about race? No, you know, that would not be a good idea. You know, and so there needs to be the creation of these spaces, and that's one of the things we discovered was about the organizing. So the starting with storytelling was critically important, but then moving on from the storytelling to give people a chance to actually understand the nature of the problem, because we don't learn about race in schools. We don't. We just don't learn about it. I mean, there are a few places now that are beginning to help us understand the history of racism, but most places are not. And then what happens when you get out of school? You go to college, most colleges don't provide those spaces. You go into the workplace, most workplaces don't acknowledge it. And so there we are, you know, in our segregated, for the most part, communities and school systems. And so those places have to be created so people have to have a chance to talk about their understanding. And then lastly, I would say, we learned early on that it couldn't just be a conversation about what would change in terms of people's individual attitude, because the danger was that white people might feel like, wow, I had a great conversation, I learned things I never learned before, and people of color would think,
okay, I shared something that I've shared with my friends my whole life, but what is going to change? So there has to be a conversation about what is going to be different in our community as a result of participating in this conversation. And those are all things that were really critical to us, plus a whole lot more, but those were the initial things that we learned.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Beverly.
Sure. Well, one of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking, Martha, is the fact that, so of course, the world that I've been operating in largely is higher education.
Yes.
And in that context, one of the things that we know is that most students are coming to college or university from segregated communities,
Yes.
right? Not everyone, but many people, because there's a lot of residential segregation and certainly a lot of school segregation still in our society. So most students are entering into a college or university that is more diverse than the place they grew up.
Yes.
And in that context, they need opportunities to learn how to connect across difference, but the institution has to provide structure. That we know that just having, people who vary in various identities, just throwing all those people together in a room doesn't do it by itself, or even on the same residence hall, that you have to create structured, for productive dialogue, for productive learning to take place, you need structure, much as you were talking about in communities. And so, of course, in the world of higher education, the coin of the realm is the classroom, right? So you can teach a course on the psychology of racism and bring students together and engage them in conversation that they might not otherwise have. And when they get tired of talking about it, it's too late to drop the course and they have to keep coming.
They have to do the work.
Yeah, they have to keep coming, they have to do the work. And so that's a unique opportunity, it's an opportunity that's unique, I think, to educational settings. But there are places that don't take full advantage. It's not just, my course on the psychology of racism, while the students who took it benefited from it, nobody was required to take it, it wasn't elective. There are institutions, I always like to lift up the University of Michigan, that has now for 30 plus years had an intergroup dialogue program, which has been starting to be exported to other colleges and universities. And again, but those are voluntary. And I'm not necessarily saying that they ought to be mandatory, but simply that it's a unique opportunity that if we don't take full advantage of it, doesn't really come around again. What we know is that students who participate in these kinds of learning opportunities are much more likely to seek out multiracial communities to live in, to raise their own children in. They're much more likely to be working in multiracial settings. They recognize the disadvantage of racial isolation and seek to avoid those kinds of situations. And so it's one of the few ways we can see to break down some of the racial segregation that has occurred and is maintained by policies and practices in our society.
You all, in your different ways, talk about and work with dialogue, and Marty, I think you had a comment to make, and so can you also address the issue of, through your work and your different unique methodologies, what do you see as the positive impacts that come out of your approaches versus potential weak spots that maybe we with our work could learn from and draw from?
Okay. I just want to follow up on what Dr. Tatum said just for a minute. So what's an intergroup dialogue class?
Okay, so the model that Michigan uses and that many people are now using is a sustained dialogue opportunity where students a class is intentionally structured to have equal numbers of students who come from groups that have a history of conflict.
I see.
So it might be, 15 white students, 15 students of color in a dialogue experience that is going to be facilitated, and it's going to go for at least 8 weeks, maybe longer. And there's going to be a structure starting with storytelling, personal stories, but then looking at the ism, and this
Whatever
case
the ism
racism,
is.
whatever the ism is that they're focused on, and what I'm going to call the sort of hot topics within that. Maybe the hot topic is affirmative action, or maybe the hot topic is the growth of white nationalism, or whatever it might be. So there's going to be some content that they're going to be grappling with,
Yes.
and then they're going to be focused on action. You know, what
do you do next?
Yes, what are the next steps? What are the action steps that we can take individually or collectively?
And that's not that different from challenging racism.
No, well, what I would say about the dialogue in our context, and it's very kind of affirming, you know, to hear your talk about stories, because that's where we start.
Yeah.
And I think the power of dialogue is in that goal of building relationships.
Yes.
Because if it's over a period of time that people can process this information that's challenging to them, and that says there's something that they thought they weren't, racist, that is, and the relationships themselves then have the potential for leading to action.
Yes.
And any one of those pieces by itself isn't enough. It's one of
Yes.
those necessary and sufficient questions.
Yes.
You can have the storytelling, but if you don't have the dialogue and you don't have the time,
Yeah.
then you go home grumpy.
Yes.
But, you know, if
Yes.
if you can put those things together, there's this possibility
Yes.
of moving to some better place. Whatever that might be, we can agree that we'd like to move to a better place.
Yes, and I want to say something
Yeah.
about going home grumpy,
Yeah.
which is to say that we know that that will happen,
Yes.
right? I mean, we know that there's going to be
Yes.
discomfort somewhere along the way. And I often, when I'm talking to college administrators who say, okay, well, you know, we're not going to do a course, but we want to have like an afternoon workshop. You know, that's not going to work.
No.
I mean, because what often happens in those kind of short, you know, people are trying to do the short version, you know, the Reader's Digest version, they get that arc of discomfort
Yes.
at its peak, but don't get the
rest.
benefit of it, right? You know, so if we know that, you know, people are going to come in and they're going to be tentative, and then they're going to start sharing their stories, and then there's going to be conflict, if we stop there, all you got is people going home grumpy, right? And who will say, I tried that, it made
did
things
not work."
worse, I'm not doing it anymore,
Right.
right?
Right.
But the benefit of saying to people, you know, make a commitment. It's going to be 8 weeks or however many
Whatever
weeks,
time.
or, you know, 15, you know, a semester is 15 weeks in a lot of places. You know, then you have, people will get to that grumpy place, you know, that uncomfortable place, but then they have time to work through that and then actually feel the benefit of that hard work. Because after you get over that hump, it starts to feel better. You know, people start to feel like, okay, I get this. I'm starting to see how we might be able to do things together.
Yeah.
And there's actually, the word that comes to mind is joy. I mean, there's often a great deal, I mean, those students who wrote on my evaluation that first time got repeated a lot, you know, over the course of my career, when they say, this is the best experience I've had. Now, in the middle, they say, I am tired of this, right?
Yeah.
But when they get to the end, they're saying, you know, thank goodness, I'm so glad I was able to do this.
Yeah. So I think dialogue is the key to breaking out of that loop.
Yes.
That world that white people live in, that's just this circular reaffirming set of information.
Yes.
And it gives the possibility of doing that.
Yes.
Jerry asked a question about advantages and disadvantages about these different approaches. And you know what we do in our conversations is the basic one is 11 sessions. So this is a
So
commitment.
there you go. Yeah.
27 and a half hours. You know, that's a lot of time out of anybody's life. They're in 2.5 hour sessions. So, but the advantage of this is just what we're talking about. That
Yes.
I think our data shows that after that period of time, most people, you know, 50% of the people who were surveyed last year said that if they are in a space where people do something that is racist, you know, creates an ouch for them, that they want to talk, they confront it. They talk to the person who's involved. 50%, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And you know, I can't say that in our community we've produced change. I feel like we're getting closer maybe, but that's the big advantage. The disadvantage, of course, is time.
Yes.
It's a time commitment, and so it's hard to get people who don't as you said, whiteness isn't, people don't see that they're white. Hard to get them to, the people that you want the most often, you know, for example, we get very few white men, very few white men.
Yeah.
Which is very good evidence of the fact that we have trouble getting people to commit the time. And so that's the downside. A colleague, Michelle, who's in the audience, often says about this particular subject, like, it took us 400 years to get here. You should be willing to spend 27 and a half hours to help get out.
Yes.
So
yes.
true.
Yeah.
So true. So true. So the question was about impact and,
what works, what
and
doesn't,
what works,
with
what
your
doesn't.
approach that maybe we can learn from.
Yeah, I'll build on some of what Marty said, because I think we're all saying, we've all learned very similar lessons in very different kinds of settings. So what we have primarily done is worked with community groups who are building a large-scale dialogue to change program. They may be focused on a particular issue, such as policing or jails or schools, but the recognition that you have to build a coalition that's diverse so that those people in turn can recruit people whom they know. Because when you think about it, the reason anyone goes to anything is because somebody they know and trust asked them to do that. And so it's really important from the outset to model those relationships from the very beginning. And it's also really important to commit to action, to acting on what comes out of it from the very beginning. So sometimes public officials and school officials and other nonprofit or neighborhood associations or faith communities are involved in this. I would say that when all of that happens in terms of the organizing, and say, I'll give you an example, say in the community of Syracuse, New York, where they've done this kind of organizing for 20 years, maybe 500 people across the community are meeting in diverse groups all across the community and meeting for 6 or 7 times for over several weeks. And then there's an action forum at the end of that where people come together to say, what do we need to change here based on what we learned in our dialogues. So in places like that, changes that have happened, and you'll get some information about this, just a little snippet of some ripple mapping we've done in the last couple of years. Things like changes in policing practices, changes in school hiring policies, changes in tracking at school, changes in curriculum, teacher training changes, or more diverse hires in school systems. So I would say at its best, when people do that kind of organizing, it can lead to not only to personal change, which is actually the key to institutional change, but it can lead to institutional change. Here's the downside that I don't think will surprise any of us up here. It takes a lot of commitment and leadership at the local level to sustain that kind of engagement. And it takes a lot of resources to do it in terms of bringing people together. It doesn't just happen easily. So in the best cases, sometimes a human rights commission might actually have staff members dedicated to doing this, and that's a really great thing. But you know, and sometimes there might be turnover of a mayor or a school superintendent who's setting a completely different tone, and that makes a difference. So I would say that, you know, we haven't, kind of what you were saying, it's taken us 400 years. It's not going, nothing is going to be a magic bullet. But the good news is when people begin to deconstruct what has been created and see that they can construct systems that and institutions that are different, that's possible to do.
And I guess it's very similar with the commitment to a 23-hour challenging racism course. It's the same thing, a commitment to a university course, but
And you know, one of the things that I talk about in my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, in the new version, the last chapter, the epilogue, gives some examples of dialogue experiences, not just in the university, but also in the community. And I think what we're hearing described by both Marty and Martha is what are the key elements of those successful community programs. That there is a period of trust building, which comes as a result of, you know, oral sharing stories. I think that's necessary for sure. And then there's an opportunity to think about what needs to be changed, you know, some kind of collective thinking about what needs to be changed, and then working together to do it. And I think the key of the trust building is also the building of empathy. I think you used that word, Martha, when you were speaking. And in fact, it's empathy, I think, that I call it the empathy gap, you know, that contributes to the persistent nature of what the, you know, the dehumanizing of the other, whoever that other is, comes as a result of lack of empathy. So when we can build empathy, we're halfway there.
So when we're, did you have a comment?
No, go ahead.
To say I'm just thinking about is we are at CRS facilitating our dialogues. It's very important to us. I'm thinking about the role of the facilitator in helping that trust have a space to build and the empathy. And we focus very much on the concept of neutrality. And I know that's always an element of dialogue where there's a facilitator helping that conversation go back and forth. And from your work, can you comment on just the role of neutrality? How do you keep yourself neutral, especially with some of these divisive issues that just want to, you know, get your gander up? How do we remain in that neutral space? Or do we have to?
Well, I'm not clear that we do, right? So let me just say that.
There we go.
So for me, I mean, when I was leading workshops a lot, which I do less often now, but when I was leading workshops a lot, one of the things we used to say was that there was a difference between being values neutral and values clear, right? And so, I mean, to say you're neutral is to say you don't have a position. But if you understand, as I think about racism, for example, as being either or, right? It's not like there's a wonderful book that just came out yesterday. I want to put in a plug for it, by Ibram Kendi. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And in the book, he makes a point which I completely agree with, which is that either something is either racist or anti-racist.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as non-racist.
No.
Right? You know, so if we understand racism as a system of policies and practices, sometimes people are actively racist, sometimes they're passively racist. But there's only one alternative to that, which is actively anti-racist. You can't be passively anti-racist, right? Everybody here in this room, I'm sure, understands that. So if you're saying to me, you know, what does it mean to be neutral? Is there some space between racist or anti-racist? I would say there isn't. So then the question is, how do you articulate the fact that you have a value system, which I certainly would, that is striving to be consistently anti-racist, and at the same time, you know, you can listen respectfully to someone who doesn't necessarily share that point of view.
Yes.
So there's a difference between, you know, respectful listening to someone who doesn't agree with you and not being clear about what your value system is.
I'm just thinking about Marty, I know talks a lot about if people aren't in the room,
Yes.
if you're,
Well, I think the
How do
point
you-
that you're making is very well taken, and I think, at least from my perspective, we have a mission statement and a vision statement that's very clear. We're challenging racism. That's what
Yeah.
this is about. This is an anti-racist organization.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when you're actually functioning as a facilitator in a group, I think in that context, then neutrality is important, so that everyone has the possibility of thinking that they are heard. People who, for example, these white people who are so out, you know, feel this loop and don't get what's actually going on. It's important that that point of view, that clueless point of view that they have, be respectfully heard in the room.
Yes.
Otherwise, they won't stay.
But you can do that, and I mean,
Yes.
I don't know that we're saying something different.
No, I don't
And I
think
guess
so.
it depends on how you're defining neutral, right? You know, so if someone says something that expresses a point of view,
Yes.
you know, I saw a wonderful example of this. I just last weekend,
Yes.
I was at the American Psychological Association annual meeting.
Yes.
It took place in Chicago, and as part of the APA convention, they had a film festival. So I went to see a film that was being screened called The White Right, Meet the Enemy, or something like that, or Meeting the Enemy. And the film was made by a woman who is of Indian descent, meaning from South Asia,
Yes.
you know, India. And so brown-skinned Muslim woman who immigrated to the United States at the age of 6 from India. And she is interviewing neo-Nazis and leaders in these white nationalist organizations. And she's sitting with people who are saying that they want an all-white ethno-state. And so she very politely asks questions like, so, I've been living here since I was 6, and according to your, articulated point of view, someone like me, who's lived here my whole life just about, would need to leave. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Not saying, what a crazy idea, but, I've heard you say this. Am I understanding it correctly?
You're just exploring.
Yes. And that person then says, yes, that's, I like you. You seem like a nice person, but yes, you'll have to go. And, and so, but what's very powerful about the film is, and she's talking to all kinds of people who've done horrible things, and some of them say so. I used to go out beating people up just randomly, one guy says. And now, I don't do that anymore. I now see the error of my ways. But, that's what I was into, and I got other people to do it with me, and, it was terrible. So she's having these conversations, and we could say, well, is she being neutral? I wouldn't describe that as neutral. She's certainly being respectful.
Right, yeah.
She's being very reflective.
She's being respectful, but she's not saying, well, it's clear she's got a different point of view. She wants to be able to stay, right? She's got a different point of view. But what's really striking about the film, even Charlottesville, she was in all those guys marching with those tiki torches, she was at the end of the line filming. You see her, making her films. She was there. And so some of the people really got to know her. They allowed her in, and she got to know her. And at the very end of the film, spoiler alert here, one of the things that happens is that one of these very highly placed leaders in this white nationalist organization calls her to tell her that he's leaving the organization. And she asks him why, and he says, those questions you've been asking me, they started to get under my skin. And he said, and I've gotten to know you. You're the first Muslim I ever knew. I've started to, I respect you. I consider you a friend. And he didn't use this language, but as a psychologist, I would say there was just too much cognitive dissonance. That what I'm saying and talking about is not matching up with what I'm now experiencing in the context of this relationship in which I now have some empathy.
Yes.
Right? And therefore, I just think I have to do something else. So that's an example of the power of dialogue. Yes. But I wouldn't use the word neutral in that conversation.
Yeah. It sounds a lot like the effective questions technique that Challenging Racism trains about.
Appreciative listening, ways in which you draw from the other person what's going on with them, how they got to where they are.
Yes.
Those are all important parts of facilitation.
Yes.
But I think of that as neutral facilitation. That's what I'm thinking of when I talk about it.
Yeah.
It's really the techniques to get all the voices in the room, not supporting a particular point of view with which you most likely don't agree, but getting it on the table.
Right, right. And I would add one thing to that, which is that if it's in the context of solving a community problem, not everybody in the community is going to say that there's a problem with policing, for example. So, and to a certain extent, there has to be an assumption that we have an issue here that we need to address. And so that's why people come to the table. So I wouldn't say that 100% of the people in the community would name that problem in that way, but maybe 80% would, and they wouldn't even maybe agree on the nature of the problem. Lonnie Guinier said something really interesting once about this dialogue on race and when it leads to problem solving. She said that that there has to be a presumption that the goal is to create a more just community, a more racially just community. But you don't necessarily have to agree on how to do that. People will come with different ideas about what the problem is. And the interesting thing about racism is that it's such a huge systemic shapeshifter that it takes the form of so many different things inside of school systems and police departments and home life and neighborhood life and policing and all of those things, that there are different ways that we need to be addressing it simultaneously. There's not just one answer. And so I think that there is something about that that is, now some people may define that differently, and I think that's a good thing to talk about.
Yeah.
What does challenging racism mean? And for some people, I always remember myself as a person who was not literate in understanding racism. And that's very helpful to me when I talk to other white people.
Yes.
Because it helps me understand that some people were willing to talk to me
Yes.
about what this meant. Because it's a little bit like, first I like the racial equity lens thing because it's a little bit like, at first you put on a pair of glasses and you can't see a darn thing because they're the wrong glasses. And then somebody puts the right glasses on you and all of a sudden you begin to see things. And that's a little bit how I felt when I was beginning to do my own internal work. And that's where I think the connection between that and the other things we've been talking about right now really fits, you know.
Yes.
The neutrality. It doesn't maybe answer the neutrality question, but in the problem-solving context, we want as many people in the room. I've seen police officers and residents talking about the nature and connection of racism with policing, and even police officers coming with different opinions about what that looks like to them from inside the force. And it takes a lot of work to get people to the point where they can have that conversation. But
Yes.
people will have disagreements, but they won't be able to move forward. So maybe that is akin to that sort of, what I think of as kind of the inclusion.
Well, that kind of leads to the next question. We, in our work at CRS, often we are facilitating dialogue with groups where there is a power imbalance. Like you mentioned, the law enforcement police context, that is a lot of our work. And how does that change what you would say are best practices for dialogue and building trust when there is that huge power imbalance there? And how much is that a part of your, I don't mean professor-student power imbalance.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm kidding, but I mean the serious societal level power imbalances. Do you come across that in your work? How do you effectively navigate that?
Well, the example that you're giving is not one that I have a lot of experience with. I want to just say that. But I also want to say that there's nothing so useful as a good theory, right? That's what, there's a old social psychologist no longer living named Kurt Lewin, who said there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And in social psychology, there is a theory. It's called contact theory, articulated by Gordon Allport back in 1954, right? He wrote his book, The Nature of Prejudice. And I think most of what we've been talking about really is built on the principles that he identified, which is to say, if you want to improve relations, then you need to bring people together with equal status, sanctioned by authority, of a community authority of some kind, asking them to work cooperatively toward a common goal, right? So in your question, you're saying when there's a power imbalance, how do you achieve equal status? Well, you probably don't hold it at the police department. You know what I mean?
And they don't come in uniform.
Yes, so these are the kinds of things that sort of start to make it a more equal context. Is there some place that is, to come back to that word, neutral, right? Neutral meeting space, leaving titles at the door, and the guns and the badges,
To the degree that that's possible that people
Yeah,
think that way.
yeah, so how can you create equal status? And who's the sanctioning authority? It could be leaders in the community who said this is important and we want everybody to, come and work together, and modeling that.
Right.
And then what's the common, working cooperatively toward a common goal.
Right.
The common goal is solving the community problem. So, but I know that, maybe some of you both of you probably have had some experience with that.
Yeah, one of the things because we've been working on this issue a lot recently.
Yes.
And one of the things, in addition to all the things you said, which I think are so important, is that we've been discovering that police officers have issues inside their departments about racism.
Yes,
that
They have
surface.
issues about gender. They have issues about sexual orientation inside their departments. And so in some sense, it can feel very threatening to have that conversation for the first time with residents. So we've been discovering, you know, there are affinity groups that are racial and ethnic, but there are also affinity groups that are police and resident affinity groups. And that's really essential to have those affinity groups. We're learning that police can talk amongst themselves about the issues of racism and then how it might open to other kinds of issues. And then residents can do the same thing. And then when they come together, they might be more prepared to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would add just within the actual group, when you have a group together, I think anything that slows things down in the process that you use helps the people who are on the fringes of the group for any reason. And one of the things we use is writing, you know, journaling, reflection time, any opportunity to have the chance to formulate what you want to say so you're not at a disadvantage with the loudest voice in the room. And I think that actually going to affinity groups and then coming back with a structure, that sounds to me like a very powerful way to help this balance. You know, in the work we do, we don't have it, as you said, it's not really, in my experience, to have that amount of power differential. But there's always a power differential in any group, always.
Dr. Tatum, you've written a lot about the concept of racial identity development.
Yeah.
And how do you see that playing into the facilitator's role? How important is it, you know, for us in CRS to understand those concepts and weave them into our work?
Sure. Well, one of the reasons I wrote my book originally back in 1997 was because as I had learned in my work as a clinician and as a counselor, you know, sort of in counseling settings, reading about racial identity development theory, seeing how that was playing itself out in the lives of adolescents, college-age students, I found it really helpful when I was teaching to, because I could certain behaviors that seemed to happen a lot in my class, I could recognize as reflecting a certain stage of identity, right? And because I could map that model, that identity development model, onto the behaviors of my students in a fairly predictable way, it allowed me to think, I think, more effectively from a pedagogical point of view about what learning experiences would be most useful in this moment. You know, if I've got a student of color who's really trying to figure out what does it mean to be a young man or woman of color in this particular context, maybe they need to read something about somebody who looks like them that helps them think about that. You know, if I've got a white student who's just coming to terms with her whiteness or his whiteness and is trying to figure out, well, what does this really mean? And the only people I know who talk about white identity are Klan members. You know, that's not where I'm wanting to be. So how do I think about that? You know, being able to give them something written by white people who are really trying to become anti-racist and model that can be very helpful. So in a way of being able to sort of understand almost in a diagnostic way, and I don't mean that in a really prescriptive way, but you know, to sort of have a sense of where someone is in their own learning journey and how I can facilitate that. A better understanding of that allows for better facilitation.
And like tailor the discussion to...
Yeah, because I saw that was so helpful to me, I wanted to be able to share that information with other people, particularly educators or folks like those of us in this room who are working with people in group settings, because most people at that time, and I think probably still, hadn't encountered that information someplace else. You know, they might have taken child development or intro to psychology, but hadn't encountered that information. So making it available in a way that was hopefully understandable and easily digestible, my hope was that it would empower educators and other leaders as they are trying to do this kind of work.
I would say when I thought about this question, I thought that being a facilitator of conversations on race without studying your own racial identity development is a little like driving a car without ever having driver education. And it's like just totally doesn't work.
Just wing it. Just wing it.
Because you you can't be honest about the subject unless you've thought about how you got where you are.
Exactly.
And what all the pieces are of that, and had enough experience so conversations about race are normal. We can do this.
Yeah.
And so I think that's my biggest thought about the importance of racial identity development. The other thing about it is if you think, it's not only self-knowledge, which is a key thing, but part of knowledge of the other is sometimes facilitated just by looking at those racial identity charts. I mean, everybody doesn't fit there, and some of the things they say are kind of silly, but or maybe don't apply to you. Yeah. But it gives you kind of a ballpark. I remember a person who did one of our conversations, and she was at that time she was a school principal in middle school, and her observation was that racial identity development theory for her was the first time that she really understood the behavior. She's white. Yes. Of some of the African American kids in her school. Yes. You know, which to her seemed isolating, maybe, you know, in some ways not helpful in the larger context of the school, but then she could see why it was important to them.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
This is an aha moment for me, I'm thinking, because we do training in structural racism for people who are facilitating dialogues. But I think some training in racial, I was thinking actually as I was thinking about today, that I think some training in racial identity theory
would be very useful.
Would be very useful because as
someone has a book you could read.
Someone has a book. And I was thinking about this when I was actually rereading your book, Beverly, that there is something about the role of the facilitator. I almost think of it as setting a container for the safe development of racial identity.
Yes.
And that is it's a wonderful container if you can set it. Yes. And that the quote I love from Lonnie Guinier that I always thought was so great is she said that dialogue on race should be like a cold shower and a warm bath. That you know that it's that yes, there are going to be some moments of uncomfortableness, but it should also be some moments of comfort because that's what keeps people in the room. Yes. In our society, we don't have many of those places to have that, and so that sometimes the word safety is a little misleading because it's like, well, I don't feel safe. Well, sometimes you just feel uncomfortable. Yes. And you should always know you're going to be safe, but it's okay to be uncomfortable. Yeah. And I think white people in particular are not very practiced at that. No. And so it takes some practice, so that's but that, I'm having this aha moment and I'm thinking about using your book for training our dialogue facilitators, just like,
That's what we do.
That's what you do, right? Yep.
Yeah. Go for it.
Great.
So the last thing I wanted to ask about the role of the facilitator and the facilitator, job is self-care. How do we, this work is stressful. CRS employees, they don't come for a year, they come for life, no matter what. And they travel, they go into tension and conflict. It's wearing. How do you take care of yourself? How do you keep your spirits up? What's your advice for us to keep with this work?
Well, I want to share some advice that was given to me, and I always repeat it when a question like this is asked. Probably 30 years ago, someone said to me, if you make a lot of withdrawals, you better make a lot of deposits. And, it's good financial advice too, right? If you make a lot of withdrawals, you better make a lot of deposits. And this work can be quite draining. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly moments that are, as I like to say, there's sometimes when you're doing the work, it feels like a deposit. It doesn't always feel like a withdrawal. Yeah. Right. But there are moments that can be quite draining. And so, everybody has their own way of refueling, but you have to definitely figure out how to do that, how to refuel.
One way that I refueled last year is I went to hear Beverly speak at the Hartford Seminary.
And it was a theme actually of what you
Yes.
spoke about, which I was at a moment where I was feeling depleted, and there were just hard. There are always hard things in the work,
Yeah.
and I think there is something about being in a time period where some white people are waking up and some white people are very angry. And it's a disconcerting time in many ways. And in many ways, how to help create the dialogue and welcome people into the room is getting harder. In some ways, it's becoming more challenging. In some ways, it's becoming more doable.
Yeah.
So it's a mixed bag. But when I heard you talk about the withdrawals and deposits, and especially drawing from your spiritual tradition, and that you began to see anti-racism work for you as a ministry. And that really spoke to me, because I think along the way, and it didn't always start out that way, but I'm dedicated to this as my life work. I know that I will be an anti-racist actively for the rest of my life. And so for me, it's part and parcel of my own development. So I spend a lot of time, I actually have a support group with other white allies where we share some of the key challenges we're facing, and we share some ideas with each other, and sometimes we just listen. Sometimes we just listen to what we're dealing with. I actually spent a week-long retreat that was led by Parker Palmer's, the organization he helped to start, called the Center for Courage and Renewal. That was very important because he stresses listening to your deepest
It's all about listening. All
Yeah.
internal voice. You have to listen to yourself.
Yeah.
And for me, that really speaks to me. So
Yeah.
So, anything to add?
Well,
How do you
I
take
think
care- you don't
yeah.
take care of yourself, I don't think.
I think it's one of those MBTI things, that Miles Briggs, where
Yes.
you get your energy.
Yes.
So I get a lot of energy from the people I work with, who are fantastic. This huge range of different kinds of people, and the skills and the courage that they bring. And then personally, the way I'm a historian, that's my training. So for me, finding more dirt on Thomas Jefferson is really, that's an uplift for me. It's kind of another window, on this whole subject. And then a subset of that is about white anti-racists. There's
Yes.
very little written about them, very little.
Yes.
So that's another, because I like history.
I hope you'll write something. I mean, I say that quite sincerely because, that when I was teaching regularly with undergraduates, that was a concern all
is a
the
problem.
time.
It's a problem.
That I was always looking for information about white anti-racists, because white students, want to be able to claim history that isn't just about victimizing people.
Right.
You
And a
know.
model.
Yes, and so that is really important. And there are a few books that have been written. I remember having a conversation with Becky Thompson, who is a sociologist who was interested in anti-racism and white women, and she did write a book called A Promise and a Way of Life.
Yes.
But there, you can count on one hand probably.
Yeah, about
you
3
know,
fingers, right.
the resources like that have been written. And so if it's of interest to you and you are passionate about it, I say write it down. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I want to move on to make sure we have time to talk about societal issues. So Dr. Tatum, you've noted in your books that there have been positive, meaningful social changes in our lifetimes, but there have been setbacks. You've noted the anti-affirmative action backlash, the 2008 economic collapse, mass incarceration. How do you see these issues and challenges affecting the tenor of dialogue, and how do all of you help your group members talk about these issues?
Well, I think it's really important to educate people about them, right? That one of the things that I find is that unless you have really made it your business to pay attention, there are a lot of people, particularly within the white community, that just aren't paying attention.
No.
So when I say to people, that our public schools are more segregated today than they were in 1980, people will say, well, you know, I thought we solved that problem, right? You know,
Yes.
what happened to Brown versus Board of Education? Well, you know, we know a lot happened to it. It's been chipped away by lots of, you know, Supreme Court decisions over the last 65 years since that decision. There are things, I also think the election of President Obama in 2008, while I don't believe this to be true, it set a narrative. There was a narrative post that election that we were now in a, quote, post-racial period, right? I think there's plenty of evidence that we are not in a post-racial era,
Yes.
right? Not the least of which
Quite the
is-
contrary.
Yeah, quite the contrary. But having said that, you know, there can be, unless you feel personally impacted by some of the things that we're talking about, whether that's mass incarceration or, you know, the anti-immigrant language that's taking place, or, you know, fill in the blank. You know, if you don't feel personally impacted, you may not be noticing, right? And it's easy to say, oh, I remember when I was teaching back in 1980, that first course I told you about, I remember telling a student that I was going to be teaching this course, and it was a white student, and she said, oh, is there still racism? And I was like, yes, as a matter of fact, there is, and why don't you take my class? Right. And so there's a way, I mean, I think there are very few people who would today say that, oh, is there still racism?
I don't think so.
But having said that, people are not necessarily paying attention to the ways in which it manifests itself on a daily basis. And so sometimes just making that more visible is the starting place for the conversation. However, I also want to say that I read Dr. King's last book last year. He wrote in 1968 a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And I read it on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of his assassination. I was going to be on a panel. And so as I was preparing for that, I read the book. And one of the things that really struck me was a lot of discussion in that particular book about the pushback that comes whenever there's been progress.
Yes.
Right? He says the line of progress is never straight.
No.
After every period of progress, there are counter-revolutionary forces
Yes.
pushing back against it. And I certainly think that if we're paying attention, you can see that that's what's happening right now.
Yes.
That we've had a period of progress, maybe even pointing to the election of President Obama as a signal point in that period of progress. But now what we have is a counter-revolutionary pushback against that progress.
Yes.
And that is not a surprise. It's, if you look over the arc of history, you will see that happen repeatedly. You know, after Reconstruction, there was, you know, Jim Crow. And so so we see this pattern repeating itself. The good news is that after every pushback, there's more progress.
Yeah.
So, you know, maybe we're on the verge of a surge forward again. Let's hope so.
Martha, are you seeing this type of an effect in conversations you have across the country?
Yes, definitely. I would say that the whole, there is an opening right now where some people are becoming more aware that racism is more than bigotry.
Yes.
I would say that, you know, I mean, we still have that problem in the individual bigotry, right?
Yes.
We still have that problem when, and of course this is just kind of the way social media talks about everything, but it's kind of like, is this person a racist? Is that person a racist? And you want to say, you know what?
That's an irrelevant
It's irrelevant. The systems are embedding structural racism, and that's what we've got to work on, and we have so much work to do. So I think we see a great interest in people working on jail reform at the local level.
Yes.
You know, to reduce racial and ethnic disparities. It's a huge, or the education system. People really want to make progress on the education system. I think one of the things that might be just really missing in the discourse, people often feel disconnected and don't know that other people are doing that. And because the overarching narrative is so much of a lightning rod that it's hard to sort of see what's happening under the surface. And so we definitely see, I mean, I think there are signs of real hope in terms of people getting traction. Even look what's happening in terms of journalism or the books that are being written. I was reading an interview of Ta-Nehisi Coates in Vanity Fair yesterday, which was really fascinating. I would recommend that interview. It was just fascinating because he's come out with a novel.
Yes, I saw that.
And I can't wait to read it. But he was basically saying there's a whole generation of Black authors right now writing novels to
Very good.
reflect
Lots
the courageous parts of what was happening in the African American experience instead of focusing on all the victimization and oppression, which obviously happened, but we don't tell the story of how Black courage shaped our democracy. And so he was really great on that. And so I guess I would say, yes, I see that there are all sorts of ways that people are looking at issues, current issues like immigration, and saying this has something to do with structural racism underlying it. As an organization, we are helping people create those dialogue structures that help them look at the complexity of an issue through the lens of a racial equity history and current day focus. So.
My example is just from our work in the last really 2 years and in the community, and this is not directly related to our conversations, but for the first time in my life, I've heard there's actually a zoning map of Arlington, a land use plan that was adopted that uses the language of multi-resident dwellings. Unheard of. You know, Arlington is a very suburban, everything is zoned, single family houses, you can't, on certain sized lots. So talking about multiple family dwellings and zoning for that is revolutionary. And this is a district that only, I think 5 or 6 years, maybe 10 years ago, defeated a ballot initiative that just would have required talking about housing. Not a particular kind of housing, just any housing. That is a huge difference in 10 years. And then in Arlington and in Fairfax County, in the last election cycle, 2 Commonwealth's attorneys who had reputations for being people who would not support plea arrangements with first-time offenders, particularly young adults, that were proposed. And most of these people who were affected are young men of color and women of color, were defeated. And that was the grounds on which they were defeated. They were defeated because they had entirely too law and order attitudes toward law enforcement in their communities. And that, again, that's revolutionary. Whoever heard of such a thing? So that is, you know, that's a big change, I think. I mean, I think Brian Stevenson is one of the people who's responsible for that, no question about it. But it means people are reading those books, talking about them.
Yes.
It's really revolutionary, very revolutionary.
There is a lot of great stuff being written. And I, you know, when I was working on my book, the 2017 version, of course, that was one of the things I was doing, was trying to read what other people had written. And, you know, I spent 13 years as the president of Spelman College, and I will confess that during those 13 years, I didn't have a lot of time to read. And so, you know, which is not to say I didn't ever read, but I didn't have, you know, I was reading about financial aid policies and things like that.
You were a little busy,
But so post 2015, you know, just trying to get caught up on all the great stuff that other people have been writing has been really both challenging and quite gratifying. And it's really exciting to see, you know, another generation of scholars putting out some really great stuff.
I would love to, did you want to add something?
No, go ahead.
Bring up a topic that we've been talking a bit about here during our conference this week, and that's around white privilege, white fragility, and I'd love your thoughts on just in general the topic. CRS doesn't have a program right now, a standardized program, where we would actually focus on the issue of white privilege, or as you say, the positive bias toward white people that is in society. And maybe we should, I don't know, it's something to think about. But I don't know that we have tools right now to talk about that if it comes up, or to help some of our participants in our programs become self-aware and deal with the emotions around that. And I'm just wondering just how you and your work deal with that when you kind of hit a pocket or a point in the dialogue where you can tell some people are reacting and are thinking thoughts they haven't thought before and having to process that. How do you help them through that? And
Well,
I know Marty's
Well,
does a lot of
we've
doing
actually,
that.
I'm sure this was discussed in the training this summer. I think I was present for one of the discussions about this. But acknowledging discomfort is an important part of facilitation.
Yeah.
Whoever's discomfort is, if it's white people's or somebody else. And the other point I think that we discussed was that it's really important that that emotion, no matter who it is, not hijack the progress of the group in
Yes.
discussing what's actually going on. And I mean, there are different ways to do that, you know, trying to acknowledge that there's discomfort and that's natural. And if the person involved is not able to get themselves together, inviting them to step out of the room and take a little time and then come back and join you again. And then that facilitation practice, which you talked about, you know, creating the container, we're here for this purpose, reminding people why we're here. To help that person who's losing focus get refocused.
Yeah.
I
wanted to say something about the white fragility concept, right? So that's relatively new language.
Yes, it is.
And of course, it is. The term was coined by Robin DiAngelo,
Yes.
who wrote an article about it several years ago, and now has her best-selling book by the same title, White Fragility. And I recommend that book to people who haven't.
It's on our reading list.
Yeah,
so
I highly
as
recommend it.
Our many other wonderful books. Yeah.
And I think that having some knowledge about the concept is useful to facilitators for sure.
Yeah.
Because anybody who has had facilitation experience and then reads Robin's book will say, I've seen that behavior.
Yeah,
right.
you've
You
seen
know,
that.
you know, you recognize it, and so she's given a name to it. One of the things that I like about her concept as she describes it in her book, this idea of fragility, is that she describes it as a kind of lack of stamina, right?
Or resilience.
Yes. You know, so if you, and I like the stamina analogy because, you know, if I were to tell you that I wanted to run a marathon, I couldn't do it today because I don't have enough stamina.
Right.
Right. But if I wanted to do it, if I really wanted to do it, I would have to develop that stamina, and I would develop that stamina by practicing.
Yeah.
Right. I'd have to train. And so when we have white participants who are inexperienced or haven't spent much time talking about racism, but have been, as part of their growing up socialization, have learned you're not supposed to talk about it,
Right,
which
very
many
important.
people have, right? If you've learned you're not supposed to talk about it, and now you're asking somebody to talk about it, they can't help but have a pit in their stomach, right? Because they're going against that childhood socialization. And to be able to sustain the conversation without giving in to the discomfort takes practice.
Yeah, it does.
And
That's a good point.
Yeah,
That's
you know,
very important.
it takes practice. So we have to create opportunities for practice. Some of that practice can happen in intergroup dialogue, but some of that practice probably should happen in intra-group dialogue,
Yeah.
right? And so when Martha was talking about, you know, a support group of white people that she works with to kind of keep her grounded, you know, she's got a lot of experience, but often for the new person, that could be a better place to start.
Yes.
You know, than, you know, I was thinking about this analogy. I live in Atlanta, and in Atlanta, they have the Peachtree Road Race on the 4th of July. You know, it's like the biggest road race in the world, I'm told. You know, that could just be Atlanta exaggeration, but like the busiest airport, right? But there's this big road race, and it happens that I live on Peachtree Road.
Oh.
So, you know, on the 4th of July, I can stand in front of my condo and people are running by, right? You know, thousands of people running by. But then if you stay out there long enough, at the end, there are people who are walking, right? There are people who are walking and they can walk the race, but you can't, they don't allow you to be a runner unless you can run at a certain speed,
time, yeah.
right? You know, you have to demonstrate your capacity to run at a certain speed. And you can appreciate that it would be a real drag for the other runners if the walkers were in the middle, right? You know what I mean? And so in that way, I was thinking that if we're really trying to have dialogue and you've got people who are running in the room, the walkers need their own little space, right? You know what I mean? Until they can get up to speed. And sometimes, and we don't often plan it that way.
We don't plan it that way.
You know, but we might think about it.
Yeah, that's a wonderful analogy.
Yeah.
So what about internally? Like we're even at CRS want to look hard at ourselves. We're a mixture of white, people of color, all across the country, all levels of experience. And we want to make sure we're not just doing the work for others, but we're holding the mirror to ourselves. And in especially your two organizations, how do you make sure your organization is willing to ask those tough questions that you're expecting community groups to ask of themselves as well?
I would say 20 years ago, we decided that we couldn't ask communities to do it unless we were doing it internally. And because, partly because the practice makes you better able to help other people. You know, it's kind of like putting your oxygen mask on first. You know, it's a little bit like that. And it was a tough transition for our staff because we had come to thinking that race was important and seeing the importance of it. And then we came to the point where we said we really need to use a racial equity lens in everything we're doing and all the dialogues that we're helping people have. Then we began to sort of do that internal work. And you know, we've done some with affinity groups. We've done some with bringing people in to train our staff and to work with us. We actually created an equity task force internal to our organization where people can go if they sense they are having some kind of issue where they can talk to someone about that. And in general, I would say there have been some bumps in the road because I think the workplace itself is a very different place for doing that than, say, a community setting or a school setting, because there are power dynamics. There are power dynamics everywhere, but in a workplace, you know, I think it's important to be respectful of that. And so we've worked with different public institutions around the country who set up slightly different ground rules about who should be in the dialogue with each other, for example. Maybe not somebody you report directly to, you know, being in the same dialogue as you, to give a sense of I can work through some of the things that I need to work through, but I don't have to do it in front of my supervisor, for example. And so I think that there are ways that this can happen, and for us, I can say it has made all the difference in the work we do externally, because we can talk about what we're modeling to people. And so we can say, you know, we had that issue too when we were talking about this, but we've worked on this, and this is what this could look like for you. And so I think it's really important.
And also structurally, because, right, white woman, co-founder, white woman, head of your group, even me, white woman, deputy. How do we make sure structurally we are applying the mirror to our organization? What have you found, Marty, that works?
Well, we are so new that we're much earlier than the point at which you're talking about. The organization, it's still an organization which absolutely everybody knows everybody, and we have very small staff. And so we really can do training and discussions about some of the issues that you're talking about for everybody. I think going forward, this is the kind of thing you have to formalize probably. We've been doing it informally, but I think we probably have to formalize it so that this is an overt part of our practice.
I would say too that in our organization, it really led to the difference in the kinds of our hiring practices, because we understood better that it took time to hire for certain kinds of diversity, that it wasn't going to be quick because people get hired through networks, and networks tend to be dominated by whites, and it replicates itself. At this point, everyone who's a senior manager or director level in our organization is a person of color besides me. from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and all with a very strong background in racial equity themselves in terms of their own identity development. But it didn't happen overnight. It really took time to get to that point where we could build that structure to do that. I mean, I don't want to kind of make it sound like we arrived. I don't think anybody ever arrives.
No.
I think you keep working at it. You keep having conversations. I mean, you know, I think we've definitely come a ways, and I'm happy to say that there were times when I thought, you know, as a white leader, can I do this? Is this the place for me? And I've talked with, you know, I've been thankful that I've had mentors of color and mentors who are white who've helped me understand what can I do to bring other management into that place. But you know, and what does it mean when I step back at some point and mentor other folks to be white allies in similar situations?
I wanted to kind of piggyback on what's been said. I'm not leading an organization now. Of course, I've been president of a college and, you know, in the higher ed space. But I'm thinking about something that you asked in the earlier question about white privilege, white fragility, and you asked about the automatic white preference reference. And that reference actually comes from work that's being done around the topic of unconscious bias. And if we think about, you know, how psychology has changed in the last 20 years, that's one of the places where there's much more research around the power of unconscious bias. And the fact of the matter is that all of us, regardless of our ethnic background, racial or ethnic background, have been exposed to stereotypes about other people. And once exposed, it's kind of like chickenpox, you know, it's in your system, right? Once exposed, it's in your system, and so it's not like you can get rid of it, but you can only become more conscious of it, try to bring it to consciousness. And recognizing that we all have bias, and that in the context of US society, that bias manifests itself, not just in the US, but I'm gonna speak specifically about the US. That bias often manifests itself as a bias that favors whiteness. And you know, that's true whether you're a person of color or a white person, right? That bias manifests itself in a way that favors whiteness. And so what can be done about that if we've all got that infection, right? Some people more seriously infected than others. You need to understand that. But if we've all got that infection, what researchers tell us is that bias is most likely to manifest itself when you're making quick decisions or in ambiguous circumstances.
Not transparent.
Yes. So you can reduce bias if you can slow down the process, which I think Martha was talking about in terms of hiring. If you can slow down the process and if you can reduce the ambiguity. And one way you reduce ambiguity is by making clear what your goals are. So if you're in an organization and you say, it's clear that one goal we have in this organization is to be an organization that reflects the population we're serving. We need to have diversity that reflects the wider population that we're engaging with. If that's a clear goal, then when you're structuring your hiring process, you've reduced that ambiguity. As opposed to if you just say, we want the quote best person. Well, that's a very ambiguous statement. You know, because best is in the eye of the beholder, right? How are we defining best? Let's define that very clearly. You know, what best might be today, the person who best helps us reflect the diversity in our community and will bring a racial equity lens because we know that's important to what we're doing. You know, the more specific we can be, the less ambiguity there is. And the more time we're willing to commit, the less we are falling into the trap of speed.
The last time we at CRS were able to do a little wave of hiring, we sort of hurried and ended up with people we grew to love, and you know, and was sad when they actually had to move on. But they were 3 white individuals. And we sort of, I think, thought institutionally, how did this happen? And it was because our source was what, between the structures that lead to that source that we had used, led us to a pool that was like 99% white. And in our rush, we didn't really notice that until some of our leadership internally said, hey, look what
happened?
Not me, I wasn't noticing, I was rushing.
Yeah.
Look what's going on.
Yeah.
And we have to, and it's just such wise advice to say, pause, be deliberate, or you sort of rush to something that might be hurt your overall goals.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I want to give a hiring example. Again, this is a research example, but it's a great example of how bias plays itself out sometimes. So there are two researchers, John DeVideo and Samuel Gartner, who have done work, they're social psychologists, done work in this area for 40 plus years. And they did a classic study years ago, 1989, in which they asked college students, white college students, were their subjects, and they asked them to rate applications for a student worker job, right? So students were applying for a job as peer counselors, and the white college students were asked to evaluate the applicant pool. And half of the applicant, always, whatever group they were looking at, it was half white, half black applicants, right? That's how the study was set up. And in one case, the applicants were considered highly qualified. In this experiment, just to be clear, the credentials are exactly the same, right? Except in one instance, the evaluators think they're evaluating a white applicant. In another instance, they're evaluating a black applicant, but the credentials are identical. So that's how it's set up. So when the credentials are identical and highly qualified credentials, there is they found no discrimination. The students said, yes, hire this person, white candidate, or hire this person, black candidate, at the same rate. It was because it was clear, the choice was clear, no ambiguity. Of course, highly qualified, both should be hired. Similarly, when the credentials were structured in such a way that anyone would say, this is a weakly qualified candidate, again, no disparity in the decision making because it was not ambiguous. The white candidates are weakly qualified, the black candidates are weakly qualified, reject them all, right? No problem there. Where the bias crept in was in the middle, in the moderately qualified group, right? If somebody is moderately qualified, you could say yes or you could say no. They have some strengths, they also have some weaknesses, you could maybe toss a coin. Except what happened was, in the moderately qualified group, the way bias manifested itself was to give the white applicants the benefit of the doubt.
Yes.
Right? So the moderately qualified white applicant got the benefit of the doubt, and 75% of the moderately qualified white applicants were given the, yes, hire those people. Whereas only 40% of the same identical qualified, 40% of the black applicants got the okay, right? So they didn't get the benefit of the doubt that the white candidates were getting. They did the same study 10 years later, in 1999, with the exact same result. And fast forward to today, the work that's being done by the unconscious bias researchers, Mahzarin Banaji and her co-worker Greenwald, Anthony Greenwald, are finding essentially the same thing. It's a consistent finding.
Yes.
So that's the way the automatic white preference plays out. It plays out in giving the benefit of the doubt to the white candidate in a way that or in the police shooting, giving the white criminal the benefit of the doubt, as opposed to, oh no, I have to shoot this person when they're a black or a person of color.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to end with the final question, which is broad, and it just basically says what motivates you, what inspires you, what gives you hope. We're trying in our conference to focus on hope for the future, and I know each of you have sources of that to keep the work going, and so could we start with you, Dr. Tatum?
Sure. Well, let me just say, I think it's really important to cultivate hope, right? And sometimes it feels like that. You got to cultivate it. You got to water it and put some sun on it. And I heard Brian Stevenson in an interview not long ago in which he said, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Wow. Right? Hopelessness is the enemy of justice. And so, and then he said, when hopelessness prevails, injustice persists, right? So we have to stay hopeful, otherwise we just give up. You don't get out of bed in the morning. So I think that for me, in this particular moment, I am looking not for big signs of hope, because sometimes, you don't find them, but it's kind of like in winter you look for the crocus coming out of the snow, the first one, right. And so I live in a community, I live in Atlanta, and in my community there are things happening in my community that I find very hopeful. And so sometimes focusing locally, I think helps, because that's the space you know the best, and you know where those crocuses are going to show up. You know where to look. And so, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really celebrate those opportunities when we see, when a new book comes out that's great, I want to post that on my Twitter feed.
Right.
Because
It's a crocus.
Yes, it's a crocus.
Exactly. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Martha?
Mine is very similar, and I would say some people say, some people have said to me, you have such a hard job, you're working with these communities all over the country, they're dealing with such tough problems. I'm sure people say that to CRS employees also. And yes, it is. But the other thing is, I see every time I spend time in a community and I hear people sitting down together to actually share their stories and begin to figure out what to do to improve their community, I just come away like completely exhilarated. I just think, it just gives me so much hope. It keeps me going, because I think, it's so easy to key into the things that are not working well, and our whole way of getting information these days is really, it's really designed to trigger our nervous systems in a particular way, away from hope and toward fear. And I think that it's really important to tune out from that. I love podcasts, so I will say podcasts is one thing that helps me. So Krista Tippett's show On Being, I really love that. If you have a chance, listen to John Powell's interview with Krista Tippett. I think it's just, John is just a wonderful, he's written a great book called Racing to Justice, and he's really good. But just things like that help you key into that inner voice in yourself that is saying, let's keep hope and let's help other people find hope. So for me, that is kind of the essential of what keeps me getting up in the morning. So.
How about you, Marty?
For me, it's actually a phrase from your book, which is focusing on your sphere of influence.
Yes.
Because the whole problem is just so enormous.
Yeah.
But if you can focus on something that's doable and next to you, some risk you can take that's small but important, that's really what keeps me going.
That's great.
That's wonderful. Well, with that, I'm going to not ask more questions, because we have an hour upstairs on the 5th floor for our reception with our panel members. And you can, if you're able to stay, you can have a little nibble, continue the conversation, ask some questions, get your book signed. And I just wanted to mention one thing for the CRS staff. We've got a final exercise that's upstairs. When you go into the reception room in the large conference room, there's, Melody, can you hold up? Thank you. There's some large Post-it notes. Yes, that is a Post-it note. They're orange and I think pink on the counter. And we would love it if you would just write on it something, an action you've decided to take because of this conference, something you learned, something that touched you. If you'll write it and put it on the cabinet where you'll see there's already one or two there, then as we look at what others are committing to, and I stole this idea from Marty, so I thought it was wonderful, and so it's going to live on today. Thank you. If you see an action, and this could apply to, please participate as well, and even you three, please participate, that speaks to you and you want to write a note to that person to say, I agree, I'll do that too, call me when you've completed that, or let's do it together. At the end of the time before you leave, take your Post-it note home with you so that you have that little commitment, and a commitment I made at a training I went to from with Challenging Racism was to read a book and listen to a podcast, and I've got the book down, I'm in the middle of a podcast, so it really helps as a little commitment. So I think it would be great if we'll try that. And just with that, thank you so much. This has just been challenging, inspiring, provoking, and it's just such a treat to spend time with the three of you together. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much.